In the year 1840, bathing was not quite the daily ritual many people imagine today. In fact, most Americans at the time rarely took full-body baths, and when they did, it was often more of a logistical endeavor than a cleansing pleasure. Houses rarely had indoor plumbing. Heated water was a luxury, not a given, and so, most people simply adapted. They washed only what they needed, when they needed, using what was available. It wasn't laziness. It was practicality. A typical morning began not with a shower, but with a basin. Inside many homes, whether a modest farmhouse or cramped boarding room, there might be a single porcelain or tin basin resting on a wooden washstand. Into this, someone would pour cold water from a jug or bucket drawn from a well or pump the night before. If they were lucky, they had time. The idea of a bath, in the sense of sitting in a tub of hot water, was more of an ordeal. First, one had to gather the water, usually several buckets full. Each had to be heated on the stove or over the fireplace. Then a tub, often wooden or tin, was hauled out, sometimes into the kitchen where the warmth of the hearth could take the edge off the chill. Only then could someone soak. And by then, the water was cooling fast. Because of the labor involved, full baths were reserved for special occasions or particular needs. Illness, a rare moment of leisure, or when company was coming. Even then, the entire family might share the same water, oldest to youngest, one after the other. It's where the phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," likely got its sting. Bathhouses existed in cities, of course, but they were not common in rural areas. And public facilities often carried a reputation, sometimes as respectable places, other times as unsavory establishments that walked a line between hygiene and scandal. Interestingly, the resistance to bathing wasn't always due to effort alone. For many, bathing too frequently was seen as unnecessary or even harmful. Some doctors of the early 19th century warned that warm baths could weaken the body, open the pores to illness, or stir up passions. Cleanliness was encouraged, yes, but it was often defined by clothing and appearance more than by skin and scent. Perfumed handkerchiefs, hair pomades, and starch-scented collars masked natural odors. People changed shirts and undergarments more often than they bathed. Laundering clothes was easier than washing an entire body. So, they washed what showed and freshened what could be freshened. And in a time before deodorant or dry shampoo, that was the norm. Children might be bathed more frequently, though not daily. A mother might lift her toddler into a small tub on a Saturday evening, lather with lye soap, and rinse quickly before bedtime. But even this was more about ritual, preparing for Sunday church, than about routine sanitation. All this might seem strange to modern minds raised on hot showers and scented body wash. But in 1840, most people didn't view daily bathing as necessary or even appropriate. They weren't dirty by their own standards. They were simply living within the bounds of what was practical, acceptable, and advised by the knowledge of their day. Hygiene existed, but it looked different. It smelled different, and it was shaped less by personal desire and more by what the home, the hearth, and the culture allowed. Saturday evenings in 1840 had a rhythm of their own. For many families, especially in rural America, that rhythm included the closest thing to a weekly bath anyone might take. It was a kind of preparation for church, full company, or simply to start the new week with a fresh face. But even this event, the Saturday night bath, was less of a ritual and more of a chore, tucked between feeding livestock and mending socks. The bath itself often happened in the kitchen, the warmest room in most homes. There, the heat from the iron stove or fireplace lingered into the evening. A wooden or metal tub would be hauled in from its storage place, maybe behind a curtain or out in the barn, and set on the floor. Then came the water, bucket after bucket, drawn from the well, the pump, or the nearby creek, depending on the season and the household's resources. Heating the water was no small feat. It might take an hour or more to get enough hot water for even one person's bath. A large kettle or pot sat over the fire, steaming slowly, while smaller pots simmered nearby. Once warm enough, not hot, but passable, the water was poured into the tub. If the household was large, or the weather bitterly cold, they might add more as needed. Soap was homemade or bought in rough bars, usually made from lion animal fat. It stung the eyes, dried the skin, and smelled faintly of ash or lard. Shampoo, as it exists today, didn't yet have a place in most homes. Hair was washed with soap, rinsed with vinegar or water infused with herbs like rosemary or mint if available. Children went first, then older siblings, then parents. In families with many children, the youngest might bathe together. Modesty was flexible, shaped more by necessity than decorum. The water cooled quickly, and by the time the last person stepped in, it was cloudy, tepid, and less than inviting. But no one complained. It was better than nothing. It was clean enough. And for many, clean enough was just that, enough. The rest of the week, people stayed fresh in other ways. Women brushed their hair daily, sometimes coating it with a bit of oil to tame frizz and add shine. They tied it back in modest buns or braids, covered it with linen caps or bonnets. Men used stiff brushes on their coats and breeches. Dust and dirt were common, but no one expected to be spotless. A strong scent of smoke, sweat, and starch lingered in most homes. It wasn't unpleasant. It was just life. Washing up happened at a basin, as it did most mornings. Hands, faces, and necks were wiped clean with damp cloths. Feet might be scrubbed if sore from the day's labor. Armpits dabbed. But beyond that, bodies were left alone. To wash more often, to strip down in such a chilly world, seemed extravagant or even unhealthy. The idea of bathing daily would have sounded absurd to most. After all, a bath could take 2 hours to prepare and clean up. And for what? The medical beliefs of the time, too, played a role. Many doctors still warned that too much bathing could lead to chills, weakened immunity, or nerve trouble. Pores, once opened by warm water, was said to invite illness. Better to stay bundled, stay dry, and stay regular in your habits. This wasn't just country thinking. Even in cities like Boston or Philadelphia, most homes had no running water, no dedicated bathrooms. Public bathhouses were more common, but they cost money, and not everyone trusted them. Some were respectable, others were less so. So, the Saturday night bath held its ground. It was a compromise, a balance between effort and comfort, health and modesty. It didn't need to be pleasant. It just needed to be done. Afterward, families settled in, cleanish and warm from the fire. They might sit together by candlelight, reading from the Bible or reciting a poem. Hair was braided, stockings were darned, boots were polished for Sunday. The scent of soap, faint and earthy, drifted through the room, mingling with smoke and tea and stew. And by bedtime, no one was thinking about the next bath. They'd cross that creek again next Saturday. For many Americans in 1840, the notion of cleanliness didn't begin with the body. It began with linen. If your shirt was clean, your apron bright, and your socks free of visible filth, then you were presentable. And that mattered more than smelling like lavender or stepping out a hot bath. In fact, people associated clean clothing with moral character. A well-pressed collar, a stain-free bonnet, or a fresh white chemise said far more about a person's discipline and respectability than bare skin ever could. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about social standing, especially for women, who were judged more harshly for untidiness than men. That's why laundry was a constant, even if bathing wasn't. Every few days, a wash tub might appear on the back porch or in the kitchen, steam rising as garments soaked in water mixed with lye or grated soap. Shirts and petticoats were scrubbed against washboards, rinsed in cold water, wrung out by hand, and hung on lines to dry in the wind. Clean linens were cherished, not just for comfort, but for peace of mind. Most homes kept multiple sets of undergarments for this very reason. It was easier to rotate fresh layers than to wash your body. Men changed their undershirts often, as well as their socks. Women swapped out drawers and chemises regularly, washing them by hand even if it was just in a bowl of water by candlelight. And so, it was entirely possible to look and feel clean without bathing for a week or more. But that didn't mean people ignored their bodies. They just took a piecemeal approach. A damp cloth could be used to wipe the armpits. A rag with vinegar or spirits might freshen the feet. Some used rosewater or cologne to dab their necks or wrists. Lemon juice or vinegar could be rubbed into the scalp or behind the ears to combat oil and odor. Hair was a different matter altogether. Washing it was rare, especially for women. A full wash might happen once every few weeks, sometimes only once a month, because it was such a process. First, the water had to be warm enough. Then the soap, often harsh, had to be lathered and rinsed out. Afterward came the drying, which could take hours in winter. Instead, women brushed their hair daily, often vigorously, to remove dust and distribute natural oils. Men, whose hair was usually shorter, could afford to wash it a little more frequently. But even then, few saw the point. Facial grooming, however, was a more regular affair. Men shaved with straight razors, soap, and bristle brushes. Some did it daily, others every few days. Barbers were common in towns and cities, offering shaves, haircuts, and the occasional application of bay rum or pomade. It wasn't uncommon to see men with slicked hair and freshly trimmed whiskers, despite having not washed the rest of their body in days. In some communities, especially among wealthier families, a separate washroom might be carved out, essentially a closet-sized space with a basin, jug, and towel rack. But most still relied on the kitchen basin or bedroom corner. Water was precious, soap was scratchy, and time was always in short supply. Bathing outside the home was more common in port towns, where sailors and laborers could find bathhouses offering hot water, sometimes even massage or medical treatment. But again, cost was a barrier. A nickel might not seem like much now, but for a working-class person, it was a half-day's bread. Winter added its own layer of reluctance. The thought of undressing in a frigid room, with icy floors and drafty walls, made even the most cleanliness-minded person hesitate. Some people believed that bathing in cold weather could shock the system or make one vulnerable to pneumonia. So instead, they bundled tighter, added more layers, brushed the dirt off their sleeves and carried on. By today's standards, life in 1840 might seem unsanitary, but the people living it didn't see themselves as dirty. They had their routines, their strategies, their standards. What mattered was not smelling like a rose, but not smelling like anything at all. Neutrality was the goal. Subtlety was key. And so, they folded fresh linens, boiled water when they could, and did their best with what they had. Because in 1840, cleanliness wasn't about daily rituals or sparkling tubs. It was about balance, between effort and dignity, between custom and comfort. And it was a balance most people knew how to maintain. The ritual of bathing, when it happened in 1840, was rarely spontaneous. It required planning, often an entire day. First, there was a matter of fuel. Wood had to be chopped and kindling arranged. Then water was carried, sometimes in heavy iron buckets, from a well or pond to the stove or hearth. Once heated, it was poured into a large tin or wooden tub, often set in the kitchen where it was warmest. And still, after all that effort, the water didn't stay hot for long. Families took turns, starting with the eldest or most honored, usually the father, then the mother, then the children. By the time the youngest bathed, the water was tepid at best, and no longer clean. Hence the old expression, "Don't throw the baby out with the bath water." It wasn't just a saying, it was a very real concern. Because of this, full-body baths were typically reserved for special occasions, holidays, visits from out-of-town guests, or seasonal milestones like spring cleaning. Some households bathed once a week, others once a month, and many went longer. It wasn't considered shameful, just practical. Instead, people focused on maintenance. Washcloths, often called flannels, were used to scrub the neck, armpits, and behind the ears. Women wiped down their arms and faces each morning with rose water or lavender, if they could afford it. Poorer households used vinegar or alcohol. Children were taught early how to clean themselves with minimal water. A basin, a rag, and a strong hand could go a long way. School bags sometimes included hygiene lessons. Cleanliness is next to godliness, they read, though the methods remained modest. Some towns and cities had bathhouses, usually located near rivers, markets, or docks. They catered to travelers, sailors, and those without private means to wash. Bathhouses ranged in quality. Some were simple rooms with tubs and screens. Others offered herbal steams or even attendants who scrubbed backs and poured rinse water by hand. But again, this was not an everyday affair. At best, a monthly treat. The wealthy, however, lived differently. In grander homes, servants prepared baths with scented oils. Copper tubs were filled behind drawn curtains. There might be a separate chamber for bathing, with marble floors and porcelain pitchers. For them, a weekly bath was more realistic, though still not assumed. And even among the rich, bathing was not automatic. Many physicians of the time remained skeptical of frequent immersion. Some worried it weakened the nerves or opened the pores to miasma, allowing disease to enter. One doctor in Boston famously advised his patients to bathe no more than once a fortnight, lest the spirit become damp. Religion also shaped bathing habits. In some devout households, especially among Puritan-descended families, modesty meant avoiding exposure, even to oneself. A woman might bathe in her chemise, never fully undressed. Men, too, took precautions. Privacy was prized, but so was restraint. Public nudity, even in bathhouses, was frowned upon. In rural areas, rivers and lakes offered opportunities for summer bathing. Boys might splash about shirtless, but girls were kept ashore, sometimes only allowed to dip their feet. Adults used the water too, but usually discreetly, at dawn or dusk, wearing loose garments for modesty. And yet, despite the limitations, the memory of a good bath stayed with people. Diaries and letters from the time mention it with reverence. Mother drew me a warm tub this Sunday past, and I felt like a new soul. Or, had a full wash before church, with soap from Mrs. Baird, smelled of lion pine. Bathing wasn't a routine. It was an event. In cold months, baths became rarer still. Water froze in buckets. Towels stiffened by the fire. People wiped instead, layered clothes, and bundled against the chill. Hot bricks were placed at the foot of the bed, not for comfort, but to avoid freezing toes in an unheated room. Even soap was a luxury. It had to be made or bought. Lye soap was rough on the skin and could irritate cuts. Milder varieties, like Castile soap, were imported and expensive. Scented soaps were rare and used sparingly, often saved for guests or celebrations. Yet, in the quiet of a warm kitchen, as steam rose from a tin basin, there was something comforting about the act of washing. Even a simple rinse of the hands and face could feel like renewal, a private, reflective moment in a world that didn't offer many. Bathing in 1840 was not about glamour or indulgence. It was about function, dignity, sometimes even survival. But above all, it was about patience. The kind of patience that comes from waiting for the water to boil. The patience to share it, and the patience to feel clean, even if only for a little while. By the time the mid-1800s arrived, a quiet tension had settled between old habits and new ideas. The Industrial Revolution had started to change how people lived, but not quite how they bathed. In cities like Boston and Philadelphia, more homes had running water, but it was often cold, unpredictable, and available only to those who could afford indoor plumbing. For most people, bathing still meant holing, heating, and improvising. Even so, change was creeping in, not just through pipes, but through culture. Magazines and advice columns began promoting the virtues of regular bathing, especially for women and children. The civilizing act of cleanliness, one article declared, distinguishes the modern lady from the brute wilderness. Illustrations showed dainty hands dipping into porcelain bowls, or mothers pouring warm water over their children's hair in sunlit nurseries. But the reality for most families in 1840 was far less elegant. Bath time was messy. It was noisy, and it often meant bathing together, or in quick succession, with little privacy. Tubs were filled in the middle of the kitchen or bedroom. Screens, if present, were makeshift, a quilt strung over a line, or a sheet pinned to a beam. And the water didn't stay clean for long. In working-class homes, people got creative. A small wooden barrel, lined with a cloth, could serve as a toddler's bath. Adults might sit in a washtub, knees drawn to the chest, And when the bath was done, the water, now lukewarm and murky, had to be carried out and dumped, usually into a garden or street gutter. Bathing, like so much else, was gendered. Men were expected to sweat and stink a little. It was a mark of honest labor. But women were judged more harshly. A woman who smelled unpleasant might be whispered about. A mother whose children looked grimy could be deemed unfit. And so, women often carried the responsibility of hygiene for the entire household. They rose early to heat water, to scrub faces and necks, to launder clothes and linens in the same water they just bathed the child in. They used herbs like chamomile or mint to mask odors, and stitched little pouches of dried lavender into drawers and bonnets. Cleanliness was both a ritual and a reputation. The wealthy, of course, had more options. Some had dedicated washrooms, where servants readied the tub and laid out embroidered towels. There were imported soaps from France, rose-scented waters from England. A hot bath was not only possible, it was pleasurable. And for some, it became a daily affair, especially in fashionable circles. But such indulgences were rare. Most people continued their routines, washing with a basin and cloth in the morning, changing undergarments often, as underwear absorbed sweat and was easier to wash than a full dress or coat, and soaking the feet before bed. Foot baths were especially common. After a long day of walking, across muddy roads, into shops, through fields, a warm basin of water and a pinch of salt could feel like salvation. Doctors, too, began weighing in. Some promoted bathing as a cure for melancholy, or a way to balance the humors. Others warned that too much bathing might lead to frailty or moral looseness. One popular manual suggested that bathing no more than twice a month would keep the body in proper regulation. Yet in boarding schools and orphanages, weekly baths were increasingly enforced. Children lined up on Saturdays, towels in hand, while matrons filled tin tubs in the laundry room or courtyard. It was part punishment, part hygiene, part training for civilized life. And still, despite the effort, despite the chill, despite the awkwardness, bathing held a certain magic. There are stories from journals of young girls sneaking an extra bucket of hot water just to linger a moment longer in the tub. Boys daring each other to dunk their heads. A grandmother who used a teacup to rinse her hair and hummed the same tune every time she did. These small memories lived on, even when the water was long gone. And so, as 1840 quietly marched toward the mid-century mark, people continued to wash, not because it was easy, but because it felt like a way to begin again. To mark time, to hold on to dignity in a world that rarely paused. The bath was a break, a moment alone, a soft defiance against dust, sweat, and the relentless work of living. And though few people bathed often, fewer still forgot the way it made them feel. Clean, yes, but also calm. And for a fleeting moment, maybe even new. By the 1840s, a quiet shift was unfolding, not just in how people bathed, but in how they thought about their bodies. Cleanliness had begun to link itself to morality. To be clean was to be good, orderly, respectable. And while daily bathing was still rare, the act of washing, even partially, even hurriedly, was becoming a sign of modern decency. Morning routines reflected that change. A splash of water to the face, a rub behind the ears, a comb through the hair. These gestures weren't just about dirt. They were about dignity. For many, cleanliness was a private ritual that allowed them to enter the world feeling just a little more human. Most people couldn't bathe each day, but they could wipe, rinse, and freshen up. Clothes were dipped into bowls and run along the neck, arms, and chest. A touch of vinegar or lemon water added to the basin might cut through sweat. A bit of rose water dabbed behind the ears could give the illusion of refinement, even if the rest of the week's grime still lingered beneath one's sleeves. Even among farmers and laborers, who worked long days and sweated freely, there was a time and place for washing. Saturday night, for instance, became known as bath night in many communities, a final freshening before Sunday service. The idea wasn't necessarily to be spotless, but to be presentable, to sit in a pew without offending the neighbor beside you. In households that shared a single tub, the process often followed a hierarchy. The eldest or most honored might bathe first, while younger siblings or servants waited their turn. Water cooled quickly. By the time the final person stepped in, it was often more soup than bath. But no one complained. It was the custom. Children, as always, brought their own logic to bathing. Some hated it. Others treated it as play. There are diary entries from this era that tell of siblings tossing dried apple peels into the tub, pretending they were fish. One boy was scolded for wearing his boots into the bath, just to see how long they'd float. Another refused to come out until someone bribed him with honeyed bread. What passed for soap in 1840 varied widely. Lye soap was most common, homemade, rough, and slightly caustic. It could sting the eyes and chap the hands, but it worked. More refined families used milled soap imported from England or France, pressed into delicate ovals and wrapped in paper. These were stored in linen cupboards like treasure, taken out only for special guests. Hair was another matter entirely. Washing the hair was infrequent. Once a week, perhaps. Once a month, more likely. Shampoo didn't exist yet. Instead, people used mixtures of rainwater and ash, or rinses made from rosemary or nettles. Combing, however, was a daily affair, not for vanity, but to remove tangles and lice. In towns, barbershops offered basic washes, more often for men than women. A quick basin rinse, a razor trim, and a splash of cologne. For a few cents, a man could walk out smelling like civility. Women, however, bathed at home, often assisted by daughters, mothers, or maids. There was a kind of choreography to the process. The pouring, the scrubbing, the toweling off beside the fire. And if someone knocked on the door during bath time, they were told to wait. Bathing was private, sacred, even if it wasn't frequent. Some travelers brought their own washbasins when staying at inns. There are records of guests requesting a fresh cloth and warm water by sunup. Others made do with a public bathhouse, though by 1840 those were becoming less common, especially in rural America. Bathhouses had become associated with disease, scandal, and moral decay. For many, it felt safer to bathe at home, in one's own wooden tub, with one's own rag and soap. And yet, for all its inconvenience, people remembered bathing with a kind of nostalgia. One woman, years later, recalled how her mother would warm a towel by the hearth and wrap her in it after a bath. I felt like a pie coming out of the oven, she wrote, steaming, soft, and sleepy. Bathing was an event, not a chore. It marked a pause in the day. It gave people a reason to linger, to breathe, to close their eyes as the water soaked into tired skin. It wasn't about sparkle or scent. It was about being human. And for many in 1840, that was enough. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of privacy, or even a proper tub. In many homes, especially in tenements, boarding houses, or rural cabins, there was no designated bath space at all. People made do with what they had. A shallow tin basin placed on the kitchen floor, a kettle boiled on the stove, a curtain draped hastily for modesty if others were nearby. In those households, the act of bathing became a negotiation with space, time, and silence. It often happened in the early morning before the household stirred, or late at night, when the fire had dimmed and no one else was awake. In winter, it took courage. The chill of undressing, the bite of cold air on damp skin. One man wrote in his journal that the only thing worse than a January bath was skipping it and being called right by his wife. Some people used the river, though by 1840, this was more common in warmer regions or during summer months. Children, in particular, would bathe in the shallows, splashing and laughing while mothers scrubbed clothes on rocks nearby. But for adults, river bathing came with risks. You might be spotted. You might slip. You might come home wetter than planned and catch cold. It was not glamorous, but it was memorable. Even when bathtubs existed in the home, they were rarely plumbed in the way we know today. Water had to be hauled, bucket by bucket, from a well or pump. Heated on the stove, poured slowly into the tub, then emptied just as laboriously afterward. For that reason alone, most households considered a full bath a weekly or even monthly luxury. And yet, despite the hardship, there were elements of beauty in the ritual. Children remembered the smell of soap and lavender. Women remembered the warmth of towels folded by the fire. Men remembered the Ray's solitude. 5 minutes to themselves with no one asking questions or needing things. It was a small window of peace in otherwise crowded, noisy lives. Some even turned it into a shared occasion. Sisters might bathe together, giggling as they told stories. Fathers might bathe sons, scrubbing behind ears while teaching them to whistle. One letter from the time tells of a family that gathered once a month for cleansing day, when hair was trimmed, nails clipped, and clothes washed. The letter writer called it a kind of baptism into a better mood. Not all memories were pleasant, though. Bathing sometimes came with shame. Poorer children were mocked for smelling sour or for having dirty fingernails at school. Women were judged if their hair looked greasy or their collars stained. A traveling peddler might be refused lodging if he looked too dusty. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene. It was about being allowed in. Into a home, into a room, into society. Public health officials of the time were beginning to take notice, too. By the 1840s, the idea that cleanliness could prevent illness was gaining traction. Doctors had not yet fully understood germs, but they recognized that people in cleaner environments seemed to get sick less often. Campaigns began to promote hand washing, street sweeping, and personal hygiene, especially in cities. Posters encouraged the poor to wash their limbs weekly. Some schools began to check children's fingernails and scalp, not to punish, but to teach. Soap makers took advantage of this trend, advertising their products not just as cleaning tools but as moral agents. Virtue in a bar, one slogan claimed. Bars of soap were wrapped in paper printed with images of angels or clean-faced children. Cleanliness was marketed not as luxury, but as duty. And yet, despite these pressures, most people still moved at their own pace. They bathed when they could. They soaked tired feet at the end of a day. They washed only the parts that showed. They waited for Saturday night. They did what was practical. And in that practicality, they carved out quiet rituals, simple, slow moments that felt like small victories. One man recalled the first time he saw his reflection in clear bath water. He had been used to murky river water or sooty tin basins. But one night, after his wife had boiled kettle after kettle and poured them carefully into a wooden tub, he leaned forward and saw his face, unbroken, in the surface. "I look like a stranger," he wrote, "and yet somehow, more like myself." That was bathing in 1840. Not glamorous, not daily, not even consistent. But when it happened, when water met skin and time slowed down, it was sacred. There were those who bathed less from routine and more from belief. Superstition, old wives' tales, and even early medical theories still clung tightly to many American households in 1840. Some people truly believed that bathing too frequently could weaken the body or invite illness. They weren't being careless, they were being cautious, according to the wisdom passed down from their grandparents. In some rural regions, it was thought that opening the pores too often could let in bad humors, unseen vapors that could cause fever, chills, or worse. To bathe during certain phases of the moon was considered reckless. Others claimed that a full bath during winter could shock the heart, and that washing one's head with cold water could cause permanent damage to the brain. These beliefs may sound strange now, but at the time, they were accepted by many as common sense. So instead of full-body immersions, people often focused on what was known as dry washing. They used cloths to wipe the face, neck, and hands. Vinegar was a common solution, diluted and applied with care to freshen up or cut through the grime of daily work. Some preferred rosewater or bay rum if they could afford it, but most settled for soap and a well-wrung rag. In places where water was scarce or dirty, this method was not just preferred, it was necessary. The hands and face were considered the most important parts to keep clean, not because of hygiene, necessarily, but because those were the parts that others saw. Your hands shook hands. Your face told your story. So people scrubbed them with care. Some carried small cloths in their pockets for wiping sweat or dust from their brow throughout the day. And then there was the matter of hair. Hair, especially for women, was its own world of care and custom. It wasn't washed often, perhaps once a month, or even less in winter. Instead, It was brushed thoroughly, sometimes 100 strokes at a time, to distribute natural oils and remove debris. Combs were essential tools. A well-made comb could be handed down like jewelry, and women often carried one with them, tied in cloth or tucked into a work apron. Homemade hair tonics were common: boiled rosemary water, nettle rinse, or egg yolk beaten into lather. Some believed lard helped soften hair. Others swore by ash mixed with vinegar. Whatever the mixture, it was applied sparingly, combed through slowly, and followed by patient braiding or binding. Men had their own routines. Beards were brushed, mustache shaped with wax, and sideburns trimmed with pocket scissors. In fact, scissors were a tool nearly every household owned, not only for grooming, but for stitching, cooking, even minor medical fixes. A well-kept pair might be sharpened on the back step or passed to a neighbor in need. Despite all of this effort, the world still had its smells: sweat, smoke, damp wool, boiled cabbage. It was a sensory landscape of labor and closeness, of effort and economy. People didn't expect others to smell like spring rain. They expected them to smell like life. What's more, judgment was quieter then. There was less obsession with perfection and more tolerance for the realities of work and weather. A man with dirt under his nails was probably a farmer. A woman with sweat on her brow had likely just brought in the laundry. Cleanliness wasn't a status symbol. It was a comfort. Something you pursued for your own sake when you had the time, the means, and the weather on your side. And when all else failed, there was still the basin, the cloth, the sliver of soap. There was still the quiet moment at the end of the day when you sat by candlelight, dipped a rag in water, and wiped the day from your face, slowly, gently, like turning a page in a well-worn book. Not everyone in 1840 had a basin waiting for them at bedtime. In many poorer homes, water was fetched once a day, twice if you were lucky. It came from the well, the stream, the public pump, or, if you lived in a city, perhaps a shared courtyard tap. Carrying it was hard work, usually done by children or women. So the decision to use water for washing wasn't taken lightly. It had to be rationed, saved for the most essential tasks: cooking, steeping tea, soaking beans, scrubbing dishes. If there was any left, and only if, then it might be used for the body. That meant most people learned how to make a little water go a long way. A single tin mug of warmed water could serve to wipe down a face, neck, arms, and even a pair of dusty feet. In many households, especially those that couldn't afford candles, these evening routines were done by the fading light of dusk. Families washed up quietly, moving through the shadows, preparing their bodies for sleep in the same way they had prepared their homes: banking the fire, bolting the door, checking the latch on the chicken coop. For those who lived in cities, the washing ritual could take on a different rhythm. Urban homes were closer together, and privacy was a luxury. Some tenement had shared washrooms, often nothing more than a narrow room with a cracked pitcher and chipped basin, maybe a rusting drain in the floor. People waited their turn. Children played in the hallway while mothers wiped faces and fathers rinsed their hands after work. In some cases, neighbors would time their turns with awkward politeness, pretending not to hear the splash of water, the cough behind the door, the muttered curses when the soap slipped from calloused hands. In wealthier homes, the bathing setup was far more refined. A large copper tub might be dragged into the kitchen or near the hearth. A servant would boil water over the fire and mix it with cold to the desired temperature. Scented soap, brushes, and towels would be laid out ahead of time. The bather might soak for 10 minutes or more while a maid waited in the next room. But even then, such indulgences were reserved for once a week, Sunday evening, often, just in time for clean underthings in the Monday market. Still, most families did without. The average American in 1840 didn't bathe because they had no need to impress. There were no glossy magazines, no Instagram, no daily portraits to pose for. You were clean enough if you didn't smell offensive. You were respectable if your clothes were mended and your hands weren't too blackened with soot. Besides, winters were brutal. Bathing in cold weather required courage. The water bit like needles. The towel froze stiff by the fire. If you didn't dry quickly enough, the chill would settle in your bones. And so, habits formed. Children were taught to wash behind their ears, but not to linger. Husbands were reminded to scrape their boots before entering, but no one expected them to smell like lavender. Cleanliness was not an aesthetic. It was a rhythm, a rotation, a compromise between survival and comfort. It was Tuesday's wash pail. It was Saturday's clean shirt. It was wiping your face with the edge of your apron and calling it good enough. Clothing played a central role in these rituals. Because washing the body was hard, people relied on layers. A man might wear the same outer vest for weeks, but change the shirt beneath it every few days. A woman might spot clean her sleeves each night with a little vinegar and a brush, then hang the dress by the fire to air out. Laundry was never simple. It involved heating water, scrubbing on washboards, wringing by hand, and hanging garments on lines that stretched from tree to post. A single load could take hours, and often a whole day was set aside for it. This is why bathing wasn't just about water. It was about labor, timing, and temperature. It was an act of planning. You didn't bathe because it felt nice. You bathed because the sun was out, the wind was low, and someone had already boiled the kettle. You didn't wash your hair on a whim. You waited until someone else was done with the tub and the ashes from the stove was still warm enough to heat the rinse. Even the act of drying off became part of the routine. Some used coarse linen towels. Others made do with old nightgowns or strips of worn fabric. The goal wasn't luxury. It was warmth. The goal wasn't fragrance. It was decency. And when all was said and done, you felt no less human because you hadn't bathed that week. You were still kind. You still worked hard. You still said your prayers and kissed your children goodnight. You were clean in the ways that mattered most. As morning routines wound into evening ones, bathing, when it did happen, was often a family affair. Not in the sense of togetherness, but in order and reuse. In homes with many children, the youngest went first. A toddler might be plopped into a basin with water barely ankle deep. The older children followed, then finally the parents, each one using the same water, with a few scoops of warm added to soften the chill. The phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bath water," wasn't just a joke. It made a certain practical sense. That bath water was precious. Even so, full-body bathing remained rare. A true soak in a tub took effort, privacy, and time. Most families stuck to what they called dry or dryish baths. That meant wiping down with a cloth, using vinegar, lemon water, or even coarse salt. Salt was especially useful for cleaning underarms or feet. When water wasn't available, it scrubbed the skin without wetting it, and when wrapped in a rag, it made a crude but serviceable washcloth. In the evenings, women often removed their head coverings, unpinned their hair, and combed it slowly by the hearth. Lice were a common nuisance, and combing served more than just beauty. In some homes, sisters sat in a row, one grooming the other, a rhythmic gesture passed down like prayer. If someone had lamp oil or goose grease, they might rub a little on the ends of their hair to keep it from breaking in winter's dry air. Men, meanwhile, trimmed their beards with small shears, or scraped their cheeks with a straight razor when they could afford the time and soap. Barbers existed, of course, but many men did without. A nicked chin or a rough patch of stubble was no shame. After all, what mattered more was how steady your hands were at the forge, or how quickly you could chop a cord of wood. Grooming was a nicety, not a necessity. In boarding houses, routines looked different again. Dozens of tenants might share a cramped, drafty hallway and a washstand in the corner. You could hear someone brushing their teeth with salt and ash, someone else dipping a rag into the leftover tea to wash their face. Privacy was impossible, and modesty became a flexible thing. Some tenants grew accustomed to washing with their backs to the wall while humming to cover awkward silences. Others simply didn't bother. For many, washing was as much about superstition as hygiene. Mothers taught their children not to wash their feet before bed or they'd fall ill. Washing one's hair during a full moon was thought to cause bad dreams. And in some rural towns, people avoided washing on Thursdays because it was said to bring bad luck. These beliefs varied from region to region, but they all pointed to the same thing. Bathing was not neutral, it was loaded with meaning. The influence of religion played its part too. Cleanliness was next to godliness, some said, but others warned against vanity. reminding the young not to spend too long at the mirror, not to fuss over appearances. In churches, sermons sometimes mention moral cleanliness over bodily one. What use was a polished shoe if your heart was dark? What good was a fresh shirt if your thoughts were sinful? Yet by the 1840s, change was slowly coming. Public health reformers, many of them women, had begun to write pamphlets about bathing. They linked cleanliness with moral strength, with a healthy household. Cities experimented with public bathhouses, places where workers could pay a small fee to wash thoroughly. But even then, many were skeptical. Old habits clung tight. Some feared bathing would spread illness, not prevent it. Others thought soaking too long would soften the bones or weaken the lungs. So the evening routine remained familiar, grounded in what was known. Water was heated, or not. A cloth was wrung, or not. A child was scrubbed clean behind the ears with a warning not to fidget. And afterward came the final rituals of the night, laying out clothes for the next day, banking the fire, tucking the blankets in tight. Evening fell gently in those days. Lamps flickered, shutters creaked shut. A breeze stirred through the slats of a wooden floor. Somewhere, a baby cried. Somewhere else, a father sang softly as he combed the tangles from his daughter's hair. These moments, the ones not written down in history books, held the truest picture of cleanliness in 1840. Not just in soap and water, but in ritual, care, and the quiet love of preparation. If bathing was rare, then laundry was even rarer. For many families in 1840, washing clothes ranked among the most dreaded household tasks. Not because it was unpleasant, though it certainly was, but because it consumed entire days. Washing day, as it was called, was a fixed part of the domestic calendar, a kind of ritualistic storm that swept through the home every week or two, depending on the season and how dainty the clothes had grown. In many households, Monday was laundry day. It followed Sunday, the day of rest, and felt like a kind of penance. Women would rise before dawn, sometimes while the stars were still visible, and begin the process of hauling water from the well or pump. If they were lucky, they had a cistern or rain barrel close by. If not, it might take dozens of trips just to fill the wash tub. Cold water had to be heated by fire, which meant more wood to chop, more kindling to gather. Every step required effort. The tools were simple but taxing. A large copper kettle or cast iron pot stood over the hearth or in the yard, belching steam. Soap, usually homemade from animal fat and lye, burned the skin and irritated the eyes. Wooden washboards scraped knuckles raw. Women scrubbed, rinsed, wrung out garments by hand, then repeated the process until the water ran nearly clean. Shirts, petticoats, breeches, stockings. Every item had its own weight, its own stubbornness. Wool held water like a sponge. Linen needed extra time to dry. And yet, despite all this toil, washing did not mean the clothes came out clean by today's standards. Most fabrics were never white but a softened beige, a muted gray, the color of soapstone or old parchment. Stains remained. Sweat and earth left traces. Fragrance was not expected, only the faint sharpness of soap and smoke. Once washed, garments were wrung out by hand, twisted, squeezed, beaten. Some families had a wringer, a hand-crank device with rollers that flattened water from the fabric, but many did not. Instead, women hung clothes over fences, laid them across hedges, or strung them up on long lines in the yard. In winter, the laundry froze stiff as boards. In summer, it dried brittle and sun-bleached, flapping like flags above the grass. Inside the home, the laundry claimed every surface. Chairs served as drying racks. Tabletops were covered in damp shirts. The backs of doors bore the weight of heavy wool trousers. The smell of wet fabric mingled with the scent of stew, wood smoke, and old floorboards. Children tiptoed around puddles. Infants reached for sleeves like dangling toys. The house felt swollen with effort. Ironing, when it happened at all, came later. Heavy flat irons were heated on the stove and wielded carefully. There were no thermostats, only the hiss of water on hot metal to gauge the temperature. Women burned themselves often. A carelessly placed iron could scorch a shirt or blacken a cuff. Still, the ritual mattered. Pressed clothing meant respectability. A man in a crumpled coat might still find work, but one with a crisp collar earned just a bit more dignity. For most men, laundry was invisible labor. They wore what was laid out for them, often without comment. Boys learned to scrub their hands, but rarely their shirts. Laundry belonged to the women folk, mothers, daughters, aunts, and sometimes hired help if the household could afford it. The sheer volume of work meant that laundry was communal, passed from hand to hand like a sacred burden. In towns, washhouses began to appear. These were public spaces, usually run by widows or older women, where families could pay to have their garments boiled and scrubbed. They were loud, steamy, filled with gossip and the slap of wet fabric against stone. Yet many still preferred to do it at home, in private, where stains could be judged and secrets kept. After all, a person's laundry revealed things: bodily habits, financial status, even character. Laundry day wasn't just about clothes. It was a kind of reset. It refreshed not just fabric but the rhythm of the week. Once the garments were folded, some still warm, some stiff with starch, the household felt renewed. Bed sheets smelled faintly of smoke and lye. Aprons hung in tidy rows. Even the roughest of towels felt softer after drying in the breeze. By evening, women's hands ached. Their arms burned with fatigue. Their backs creaked as they bent to empty the final pail. But the work was done. The lines were empty, the tubs rinsed, the ashes swept from the hearth. And though no one celebrated, a quiet pride lingered. The home had been scrubbed back to decency, if only for a while. For those who grew up in homes where laundry day ruled the household, the memories clung tighter than the clothes themselves. But not every home had the luxury of routine. In rural areas or among poorer families, laundry wasn't a weekly ordeal. It was a seasonal one. Some households washed only a few times each year. They waited until spring when water ran freely again, or until summer sun could dry thick fabrics in a matter of hours. Winter washings were rare and done only if absolutely necessary. Clothes froze, cracked, and refused to dry. When it came time to finally tackle a season's worth of soiled garments, the entire family got involved, willingly or not. Children hauled buckets, gathered sticks for fires, or helped beat the clothes against rocks near creeks. Men might be pressed into hanging duties or stoking the fire. But even then, it was the women who bore the brunt of the task. They carried the knowledge of soap measurements, fabric quirks, stain remedies, and the hidden rhythm of the day. There was an art to laundry, passed down from mother to daughter, refined through repetition and necessity. Some garments were never washed at all. Heavy coats and stiff corsets were brushed clean, aired out, or rubbed down with vinegar and left to rest in the sun. Wool was tricky. It shrank when agitated or boiled, so many preferred to simply air it out and hope for the best. Shirts and underclothes, being in closest contact with the body, were more frequently laundered. These were the items that absorbed sweat, oil, and scent, and therefore bore the brunt of the work. And yet, despite all the hardship, there was something sacred about clean linen. It symbolized a kind of personal dignity, especially for women, whose domestic skill was often measured by the brightness of a collar or the smoothness of a hem. A freshly laundered garment might not look new, but it felt like proof that someone still cared. In towns, laundresses often offered their services door to door. These women, usually poor and working alone or with their daughters, became familiar figures on the streets. They wore rolled sleeves and carried white baskets on their hips, their fingers always pruned and red from long hours in soap and water. Some towns had washerwomen rows, where dozens worked in tandem near streams or communal washhouses. Their days were long, their work thankless. Yet their earnings, meager as they were, could keep a family fed. For those lucky enough to afford their services, hiring a laundress meant reclaiming time and energy. But even then, trust was required. Clothes could be lost, stolen, or returned improperly rinsed. And the most private items, undergarments, baby linens, were still often washed at home. These were considered too intimate to hand over, no matter how tired one felt. Interestingly, there were also rules about when laundry could or couldn't be done. In strict religious communities, washing on Sundays was frowned upon. Some believed it brought bad luck, always divine punishment. Others simply considered it disrespectful. Washing was a kind of loud, physical labor, not suited to the hush of a Sabbath morning. So it waited, and Mondays bore the brunt. The superstition didn't stop there. Some families believed that hanging clothes outside at night invited ghosts or evil spirits to touch them. Others thought washing during a thunderstorm could summon lightning. Whether one believed these things or not, they shaped behavior. Laundry was not just domestic. It was cultural, spiritual, and occasionally feared. Inside the home, the act of folding clothes became its own small ritual. Each garment was handled with care. Linens were pressed and stacked. Stockings were matched and rolled. Aprons were folded along creases. These acts took time. They also brought calm. Folding slowed the breath. It soothed sore fingers. It provided a sense of order that extended far beyond the laundry itself. Children often watched their mothers or older sisters perform these tasks. Sometimes they helped. More often, they played with the laundry, hiding beneath sheets, pretending wet aprons were cloaks, or trying on too big shirts still damp at the cuffs. For them, the day was noisy, strange, and filled with smells they couldn't yet name. But it was memorable. It stitched something into their sense of home. As dusk fell on a laundry day, the yard grew quiet. The last of the shirts fluttered on the line. The tubs were emptied. The fire burned low. Women rubbed their arms, stretched their backs, and looked out over their work. The house smelled sharper, crisper, clean, not fresh, exactly, but transformed. And then came the final moment, the gathering. A soft pile of clothes, warm from the sun or still damp from the air, cradled in a basket, carried inside, folded, tucked away. A day's work, sealed shut. By the time the last shirts were folded and the final petticoats pressed, laundry day had drawn to a close, not with fanfare, but with a long, aching silence. The steam had lifted, the water had cooled, and what remained was a weary sort of pride, the kind that settled into bone and breath. In many homes, this was the only day of the week that had a rhythm loud enough to overtake the usual quiet. And when it ended, the quiet returned, deeper somehow, as if even the walls were exhaling. Inside, the air felt different. The hearth might still crackle low, but the scent of lye soap lingered longer than the wood smoke. Damp towels hung over chairs, aprons lined the backs of doors, and the floor bore faint muddy footprints from all the coming and going. Yet in this domestic chaos, there was a calm. It didn't matter that hands were raw or backs were sore, because the work was visible, tangible, finished. In some families, the folding became a kind of ceremony. Grandmothers sat with aprons tucked around their waists, smoothing cuffs and creases with practiced hands. Young girls mimicked the movements, slow at first, then faster as their fingers learned the rhythm. Boys were often sent to deliver stacks of folded garments to the right rooms, balancing trousers and chemises like trays of bread. No one spoke much during this time. There wasn't much to say. The rustle of linen and the occasional creak of a stool said enough. Some mothers took this quiet window to inspect the clothing more carefully. Mending came next, if not that evening, then the following morning. A missing button, a torn hem, a sock worn thin at the heel. These were small wounds of daily life, and someone had to patch them. A needle, a bit of thread, maybe a thimble brought down from the sewing box. One by one, the garments were made whole again. Not perfect, never perfect, but sturdy enough to go back into the world. Elsewhere, drying lines still stretched across kitchens and parlors. In homes without yards or porches, women strung rope across rafters and hung clothes like banners of survival. These makeshift lines crisscrossed overhead, dripping slowly into basins or onto the floor. Children ducked beneath them like underbrush. Men grumbled but stepped around the damp hems with a kind of learned surrender. This was laundry. After all, it claimed space. And as strange as it seemed, laundry could reshape a home's identity. For one day, the house became something else. A workspace, a watermill, a factory of fabric. Then, just as suddenly, it returned to stillness. The tubs were drained and turned upside down. The soap was stored in a tin box on a high shelf. The drying lines came down. The fire was left to burn low. The house, like its people, had done enough for one day. There were small rewards for those who had labored. A slice of bread with jam, a second cup of tea, for some, a bit of whiskey hidden in the cupboard, and always, always, a sigh that came not from exhaustion alone, but from relief. Another week's washing behind them, another cycle complete. Evening brought its own sounds. Chairs dragged back into place. Fire pokers scraped ash to the corners of the hearth. The soft thump of boots beside a bed. And if you listened carefully, the sound of women's hands, still at work, knitting, darning, brushing lint from a collar, pressing fingers to a child's forehead, checking for fever or sleep. And then came the stories, told in whispers, half to children, half to themselves. Stories of what used to be, or what might still be, or what someone once heard in the next town over. Some about ghosts, some about dreams, some about the neighbors who never seemed to hang their laundry on time. These tales passed between generations like folded linens, creased by repetition, softened by time. In homes without books, these stories did the work of remembering. They carried lessons, warnings, hopes, and in some cases, they carried secrets. A shirt that once belonged to someone gone. A baby's bonnet never worn. A stain that wouldn't lift, no matter how hard the lie was scrubbed in. Laundry revealed things. It showed where. It kept records. And though it was never spoken of this way, it acted as a kind of ledger, a quiet accounting of life itself. As night fully took the windows and the final candle was snuffed, the house fell into its well-earned slumber. But the scent of soap remained, in the folds of the bed sheets, in the cuffs of a nightdress, in the braid of a young girl who had stood too close to the steam. Tomorrow would be ordinary again. Chores, meals, letters, errands. But this night, this laundry night, held its own kind of peace. While the town slept beneath a patchy quilt of stars, a few embers still flickered in hearths across the village, dim red eyes keeping watch through the night. In those warm but weary homes, freshly laundered clothes lay folded on benches, pressed into drawers, or hanging silently from makeshift lines above the hearth. Though the work had ended hours earlier, the memory of it lingered. The house had a different scent now, clean, smoky, a bit like soap and steam sealed into wood. In many homes, children slept deeper on laundry nights. Maybe it was the softness of fresh sheets, still faintly warm from the drying line. Or maybe it was the exhaustion of a day spent helping, or at least pretending to help, hauling buckets or collecting clothespins from the dirt. Whatever the cause, their breaths came slower, steadier, a rhythmic hush that matched the gentle creak of timbers in the cooling night air. But for the grown folk, especially women, sleep did not always arrive on time. Some sat near the hearth with a mug of something warm, herbal tea, maybe, or leftover broth, cradling it in sore hands. Their fingers bore the faint burns of hot irons and the rough touch of lye. Their backs ached from leaning, lifting, wringing. But there was satisfaction, too, in that ache. The quiet reward of effort made visible. In those small, firelit moments, minds wandered. Over the week ahead, over the mending still to do, over things not said at supper, over letters that hadn't come, over the sound the wind made when it curled around the shutters and whispered of something far away. It was a moment of private stillness, a space to think without speaking. Some stitched by firelight, a torn petticoat hem, a button worked loose in the tub. Others simply stared at the flame, letting it dance and flicker, letting the silence fill the room like water in a basin. These hours had no official name, but they were real, quiet pockets of self between the demands of day and the pull of tomorrow. Occasionally, a murmur rose from a neighboring room, a child shifting in sleep, a husband sighing as he turned over, the thud of a log settling deeper in the hearth. All familiar sounds, all part of the rhythm of a house that had lived through many laundry days before and would, Lord willing, live through many more. Not everyone in town had finished their washing. In poorer homes or crowded tenements, laundry rotated by necessity, not tradition. Some women boiled water by moonlight, scrubbing by candle while neighbors slept. Others waited for Sunday, or Monday, or simply the day when water, firewood, and weather all agreed. There was no one right way to survive, only ways that worked. Some laundry never got done. That was the quiet truth. Clothes were turned inside out, dusted off, brushed clean with stiff bristles. A shirt could last another day. A petticoat could be covered with an apron. Soap cost money. Water took labor. Firewood burned fast. And sometimes, dignity had to be stretched a bit thinner than usual. Still, the desire for clean clothes, and what they represented, never faded. Clean garments meant readiness, respectability, a kind of armor. You faced the world differently when your sleeves were white and your hem neat. You stood taller, walked straighter. Even if the world didn't notice, you noticed. In some households, the Bible sat open beside the laundry basket, not out of symbolism, necessarily, but because it was the only quiet time to read. Between folding shirts and smoothing bonnets, a verse or two could settle the heart in ways that no hot water could. Let all things be done decently and in order, it said. And that included laundry. There were folk sayings about washing. Superstitions, too. Never wash on Good Friday, or you'll wash someone away. Don't do laundry after sunset, lest the spirits be disturbed. Some believed that folding clothes at night invited restlessness to the sleeper. Others said clean sheets could catch dreams more gently than dirty ones. Whether true or not, people followed these rules with half belief, half habit, just in case. And then, the last candle was pinched out. The house exhaled. The night deepened. Somewhere beyond the windows, an owl called. A dog barked once and fell silent. And within those worn, soap-scented walls, the final traces of the day faded into sleep. Laundry day was done. Not perfectly, not completely, but done enough.